Hey guys, and welcome to iWizard. So today I'm excited to be doing an in-depth review of Book 1 of the Commonwealth Saga. This is Pandora's Star by Peter F. Hamilton. Let's get into it. Jordan here, welcome back. So let's get into Pandora's Star, starting with a little bit of a synopsis. So the story starts as humanity has finally embarked on its first manned mission to Mars, expanding out into space, and everyone's getting ready to celebrate this achievement. And as the astronauts take their first steps on Mars and get ready to deliver their epic lines, we learn simultaneously that a group of scientists have discovered wormhole travel. And so the Mars thing is quite literally interrupted. You'll see what I mean by that when you read the book. And this wormhole discovery launches humanity light years ahead of where it thought it would be, and down this path to create the Commonwealth, which is an interconnected system of wormholes that extends throughout the galaxy through different phases of space. So this is just the intro. Jump forward a couple hundred years into the future to the year 2380. The intersolar Commonwealth now ranges 400 light years and contains more than 600 worlds interconnected by a web of wormhole transport tunnels. And at the farthest edge of the Commonwealth, we meet this kind of loser, down on his luck astronomer named Dudley Bowes. His university isn't well funded, he's kind of burnt out, he's not really moving ahead in his career the way he wants to, but he's been tracking this interesting development with this binary star system over 1,000 light years away, and it's called the Dyson Alpha Pair. So one night, Bowes observes the impossible. The two binary stars just vanish all of a sudden. They don't go supernova, they don't collapse into a black hole. These things just seem to basically wink out of existence. And so Bowes records this event, and there's this whole race to prove what he's just observed. And will the recording be good enough? And will it arrive on time? And will Dudley Bowes get credit for his discovery? And so basically, this guy's career catches fire. Just days ago, nobody really respected the guy. The university he works for has this measly astronomy department, and nevertheless, Bowes is able to prove his observation, and overnight, he becomes this respected, visionary astronomer, and everyone wants a piece of him. So now the race is on to figure out why these stars have disappeared. And the going theory, it's really the only thing that makes sense, is that an advanced alien race has enveloped the stars in Dyson spheres, which is this theoretical idea that the actual astronomer Freeman Dyson came up with, that you might be able to build a structure around stars that wrap around the star and harness their energy. It's either that or they don't know. It's a force field or something like that. Nobody really knows. It's not clear whether an alien race is harnessing its own stars for energy, whether a more advanced alien race is trapping like a lesser race of beings inside their star system for whatever reason. Maybe it's a violent race of aliens and they're being locked in to their own star system for the safety of the rest of the galaxy and the universe. All we know is that whatever it is, it's not natural because it happened so abruptly. Whoever did this to these stars is way more intelligent or advanced than us, because we just can't fathom being able to envelop a whole star system like this. We don't have the technology or the power to do this. So because the location is too distant to reach by wormhole, the Commonwealth decides to build a faster-than-light starship called the Second Chance to investigate this whole mystery. And this ship is going to be piloted by the famous 5-time rejuvenated ex-NASA pilot Wilson Keim. And so will Wilson be able to recapture his glory days? Does the Dyson pair represent a threat? What is going on here? And so there's a real mystery at the heart of this story. Meanwhile, you have the Guardians of Selfhood, which is this cult that is opposed to this whole mission, that believes the human race is being manipulated by an alien entity they call the Starflyer. And this cult will do whatever it takes. They will use any means necessary to stop this mission because they are like conspiracy theorists. And so you have the leader of this cult, Bradley Johansson, trying to stop the mission, and then there's the Commonwealth Special Agent Paula Mayo trying to track down this enigmatic cult leader. But ultimately, guys, the book is obviously called Pandora's Star because it's about what happens when humanity arrives at a star system with a mysterious force field around it and begins poking around, looking for answers. And maybe, just maybe, the force field was there for a reason, and we shouldn't be poking around, right? Kind of a Chesterton's fence situation, because as we get there, 1,000 light years away, something truly incredible is waiting. A deadly discovery whose unleashing will threaten to destroy the entire Commonwealth and humanity itself. Okay, so before we get into what I liked about Pandora's Star, let's talk about whether or not this book is for you. I'll just say at the outset, I'm a big fan of this whole school of British space opera writers, guys like Alastair Reynolds, Ian Banks, Adrian Tchaikovsky, Stephen Baxter, of course, Arthur C. Clarke. These are guys that write these big books, big doorstopper books that are often part of larger epic series and larger universes. And it's typically hard science fiction. So this is sci-fi that really goes for rigorous accuracy. It tries to be credible in terms of how it presents science and technology, extrapolating out into the future, figuring out where we're headed. Remember, too, that hard sci-fi is less focused on character and inner subjectivity and more focused on the fate of large-scale civilizations, big ideas, societal planning, exploration, terraforming new worlds, scientific developments. It's outer space rather than inner space. So if you like that kind of thing, you really might like this. Keep in mind, the Commonwealth Saga consists of the first two books, obviously this, and then Judas Unchained here is the second. And then you have more in the same universe. There's also the Void trilogy, which consists of this first book, The Dreaming Void from 2007, The Temporal Void from 2008, and The Evolutionary Void, which was published in 2010. And these are set 1,200 years, these books, after the events in the Commonwealth Saga. And then there's also 2014's Abyss Beyond Dreams and 2016's Night Without Stars. Okay, so those are all part of the Commonwealth universe. And then you also, I believe, have a solo novel that takes place 340 years before the events of Pandora's Star, called Misspent Youth. But back to Pandora's Star, let's talk about readability. In terms of how easy it is to read, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Peter F. Hamilton is a writer for people who want to like Alastair Reynolds, but find someone like Alastair Reynolds too difficult or too high on that kind of hard sci-fi scale. With Hamilton, you're going to get some of the same goodies that you love in someone like Alastair Reynolds. It's usually pretty far into the future. You're going to get big ideas, strange alien races, mysterious space objects, wormholes, star drives, some of that consciousness, AI, cyberpunk stuff too. But with Hamilton, there are a lot of times when the sci-fi kind of flirts with fantasy. It's very much that Asimov idea that any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. I will say, though, that with Hamilton, everything that happens does have a mostly plausible scientific explanation, but Hamilton is going to kind of drive us right up to that line where our credulity is going to be tested, and then he kind of pulls back at just the right moment. So it stays thoroughly sci-fi, but the way that Hamilton writes, if you're looking for something that is like Alistair Reynolds, Hamilton is a little bit softer than that. His works do kind of bleed into fantasy. So without further ado, let's get into what I liked about Pandora's Star. I was talking to my friend Brent about this recently, and one of the things I really enjoyed was the way this book combined multiple genres and did so in a way that never felt forced or over the top. Yes, this book is obviously space opera, but it's also got heavy cyberpunk elements, I would say. There's espionage. There's a whole sort of neo-noir, gritty police procedural going on as well, where the police are desperately trying to track down this terrorist. And then there's some cold case stuff too. And all of that is on top of the whole sci-fi mystery at the heart of the story. And so there are multiple compelling plot lines at the heart of this story. And again, definitely bleeds into fantasy as well with the Sylphin and Ozzy's travels. It's really an epic voyage of discovery in a lot of ways, which I love to see in sci-fi, right? I'm not necessarily personally the type of, sci-fi fan that wants to read something like Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, which is basically just the step-by-step colonization of Mars not so far into the future. I kind of, as a sci-fi reader, want a bigger trajectory, which is why I like space opera. And you definitely get that here. At the heart of this story, there's this question humanity's investigating about the disappearance of this double star, but that's kind of always in the background the entire time. And it ends up, I would say, being the pretext for a lot of the really cool places that the characters go, the philosophical conversations they have, the alien intelligences that they seek out, that really just makes this book great. And again, I just loved the exploration scenes, like of the planet Chelva and the Sylphin paths and the worlds that they bring you to. The Sylphin, by the way, are these alien creatures that are deliberately fashioned to be like Tolkien's elves. You've got magical woods with jewelry trees. You've got ice worlds and desert worlds. So again, definitely some fantasy elements. I love too that the wormholes that the Commonwealth uses allows for these experiments in living. And I'm thinking of the Huxley Hive world that Paula was born on, which is this really weird, creepy, eugenically structured market communist world in which people are basically genetically modified to belong to certain occupations and to do certain jobs. You've got frontier worlds here in the Commonwealth where like Elon Musk style entrepreneurs are going to these worlds to develop them in their own way. There are like hyper-capitalist worlds that are just covered in urban sprawl and suburban plots where you just go to make a lot of money for a while before you retire to one of the more chill worlds, I guess. There's even a world where rich people basically go to do naughty things and have like secret affairs. I forget what the planet is called. So I just loved the aspect of variety and exploration that you get that this system of wormholes makes possible. And Hamilton really does take you places in this book. There's a planet, for example, that's really not a planet, but is like a ship. It's actually an alien being called the High Angel, with like these worlds inside of it, these enclosed like biomes that you can live in exchange for basically allowing this being to like study your culture. You have a planet where the local fungus eats polymers. There's one planet that they explore at one point. It's so cool. And they're trying to colonize it because they think it might be habitable, but they realize when they get there that if you stand in the grass for too long, these plants begin to eat you. And so the main animals living on this world are built in such a way that they're never putting too much pressure on the ground or staying in one place, because if they do, these plants that cover the planet will start to poison them and then slowly consume them. There's even a literal ghost world in here, so that all of that is really good stuff. I especially like the fact that we're not just planet hopping here. There's a story and a purpose behind all of this. Everything that we see and do in Pandora's Star, we're seeing and doing because it matters to the plot, and we're seeing it through the characters' eyes. One thing that Hamilton has a real knack for is telling the story in such a way that readers get a kaleidoscopic view of things, of the story. So, for example, there are these side stories that are great in and of themselves, even as the main story kind of burns on in the background. So there's the story with Dudley Bowes and his discovery. You've got this augmented, genetically engineered, badass cyberpunk detective Paula Mayo trying to track down this terrorist. There's the story with Tara Jennifer Shahif and Morton and Melanie's quest to become famous. Melanie, by the way, becomes one of the more important characters in the book. There is Casimir on Far Away. You've got Ozzy Fernandez Isaac, who is, again, basically like this genius Elon Musk type character who lives on an asteroid and then later throughout the book goes world hopping. There is the Exo Protectorate Council and their whole side of things. You've got Mark Vernon and Liz's journey to reinvent themselves on this new planet. And so all of these human stories, there are more of them, are really interesting kind of slices of life. And yet there's always this larger story driving everything forward going on in the background. One unique feature here, too, is the way that Hamilton does AI. It's different than anything I think I've ever encountered in a sci-fi book. Typically in sci-fi, when you have general artificial intelligence, it's either something that we human beings have under control, we've chained it up, we've found a way to make it kind of work for us, or you have AI, on the other hand, that's gotten out of control and has attempted to rule us or destroy us. In this story, the AI, which, by the way, is called the SI, so sentient intelligence, the SI has evolved to the point where it's basically transcended its boundaries. It's decided to kind of do its own thing, become its own person almost, go its own way. But the key here is that it's neither working for us nor against us. In fact, it actually has decided to colonize a planet and turn it into what essentially amounts to a giant computer. So instead of skyscrapers, you have these giant CPU towers, and that's where it lives. So it's got its own planet, and it's really cool. The SI has its own personality. It's got like this quirky sense of humor, and the leaders of the Commonwealth will ask it questions, will ask it for help and guidance, but the SI will only really help if it feels like the requests align with its interests, right? So it's if there's like an alien attack on the Commonwealth, the SI will help if it feels like its interests are also threatened. And of course, it will do things that basically sovereign countries will do. So it's essentially its own sovereign world alongside of the Commonwealth. It tries to control Commonwealth politics a little bit, interfere with elections, help certain people out, make deals with other people. And so it's kind of got its hand in things a little bit. And so I'm really excited to see the role that the SI is going to play as I get into Judas Unchained moving forward. And here's another related thing that I loved about this book, and it is the bad guys. You get two different types of bad guys in this story. You have the radical political terrorist conspiracy theorists who are trying to essentially bring down the Commonwealth. And I'm thinking of Adam Elvin and Bradley Johansson and Casimir. I like bad guys like this who truly believe they're fighting for something righteous, who believe in their bones, right, that they're doing the right thing and that the ends justify the means. Too often in fantasy and sci-fi, the bad guy is essentially like Dr. Evil, this bad dude who just does evil for evil's sake. But that is not how the world actually works. Evil is not just self-referential. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It doesn't justify itself tautologically. People most often do evil things because they have a distorted worldview, or they're greedy or selfish or narcissistic. They do evil things because of their politics, right? Or on behalf of their God, or because they're vengeful or sick, right? So you really get a sense with the Guardians of Selfhood. They are not just Dr. Evil. They think that what they're doing is right. Bradley Johansson has a righteous cause that he's fighting for, and he thinks that he's bringing about a better world. But, and this is what's really interesting too, is that it's very nuanced, and I won't spoil anything, but I just have to say, in this case, it may be that the conspiracy nuts in this book are not entirely nuts. They're nuts in some ways. They're still bad guys, no doubt about that. But they might actually be onto something with some of their theory about what's going on. And that's another part of the mystery that is really satisfying in this book. And that brings me to the other bad guy. I mentioned there were two bad guys. And of course, I'm talking about the alien primes. There are a bunch of different aliens in this book. I quite liked the Rael and the Tochi. But at the end of the day, I think the primes might be Hamilton's best creation in this entire book. And what's really cool is that we get to see the primes emerge and evolve. We get this whole evolution story where these aliens evolve from being these primitive, bovine, migratory, weird geometric looking pack creatures to become these sophisticated, advanced, mathematical race. That all of that aspect of the book is fascinating and really thoughtful and never predictable. And I just enjoyed this very detached evolutionary history that Hamilton gives us. I can't say too much about the primes because it would spoil a lot. I'll just say that the autopsy scene in chapter 18, and this scene is actually written from the primes' perspective, and that's really well done. It's one of the most incredible, most terrifying scenes I've ever experienced in science fiction. It's brilliantly written, and I remember I was listening to this particular scene on audiobook, and I was riding in the car. I was on the way to the grocery store or something like that, and I just had to keep rewinding because I couldn't actually believe what I was listening to, what was happening. My face basically looked like this the whole time. I just could not believe what was going on and that Hamilton was actually doing this. So I won't tell you about that anymore. You'll get to it, but it is in chapter 18 if you want a little heads up. But so this interaction with the primes, this brings me to one of the larger themes of this book. One of the key takeaways here is that our logic and behavioral patterns, the way we see the world and interact with it, what we value, how we think about ethics, this kind of human frame of things is far from universal. That when an alien species is wired so incredibly differently, that interacting with them might be entirely futile. That's one of the things that Hamilton really conveys well. None of your assumptions about something that you just don't know about, none of your reference points, your grid, to make a Dune reference, is not aligned with their grid. And that's not only something that you have to think about when you're trying to get along with weird, unfamiliar aliens, but it's something that you have to consider when you're trying to defend yourself from them as well. Just the awareness that they have a different way of communicating, a different way of living, different priorities, even different brains and physiochemical makeups, right? And so you can't take the same things for granted. And we forget the obvious possibility that there might just be an alien race that is just as cerebral and intelligent in the sort of quantitative, logical, mathematical, technological sense as we are, or even more so, but without any of the same ethical inhibitions that we have. So you might meet an alien being who is perfectly capable of building a star drive or erecting a wormhole or learning how to do something really technologically sophisticated, but who nevertheless doesn't even have the slightest moral qualm with obliterating a human being on first sight. All right, so at this point, I want to get into what I didn't like. Let's see, there was actually a stretch that I did find boring in the book. The Sylphin are really cool, but a lot of the stuff that takes place on the ice world, in the ice citadel, I did find a little bit boring. It just seemed pointless to drag that part out so much. Another thing, there was a court case, a court drama, I guess, that was part of the story. And it was cool that that was included, but I found it to be highly implausible in terms of how they get the guy who's charged with the crime. It's one of those things where a good defense lawyer could have offered about 100 explanations to get the guy off, and instead it's just like, oh, you've proved the case, we're beaten, darn it. It's, kind of like the end of a one of those Scooby-Doo episodes where the bad guy does not have to confess to anything, right? And instead he's just like, you darn kids have proven the entire case, and I guess I've lost because you're so much smarter than me. So it wasn't terrible, right? But I just kind of couldn't believe that just that part felt a little sloppy or rushed. You'll see what I mean, I think, when you get there, if you have any experience with kind of court dramas there. Here's one thing I want to mention that didn't bother me necessarily, but might bother some readers. So just a heads up, thought I'd mention it. The chapters do get longer and longer as the story goes on. One of the chapters was like 80 pages. So if you're one of those people who likes tight, like The Expanse, 10-page chapters, right? If that's kind of your thing and you like the kind of thriller novels that do 10 to 12 pages and never deviate from that, you're going to have some chapters that are 20 pages. You're going to have some chapters that are close to 100 pages. And so that just is what it is. It really didn't bother me. Okay, and I'll end this segment with one more thing. And it's not really something that is Hamilton's fault per se. So I'm not trying to drag him on this. It's really a problem that I have with sci-fi in general, especially space opera. I know that inner subjectivity really isn't the point when it comes to these big galaxy-spanning space opera novels, but I do find it frustrating that you really never get to go too deep with any of the characters or really get too attached to them. There are some really great characters in the book for sure, but we never really get to know them that well. There's some interior stuff, but not enough in my view. And I mention this because Hamilton is actually really good at interior work. He's good when he does try to settle us into a character's head, but he doesn't do it enough for my taste. I love those books where you really get attached to characters. My wife just finished reading The Expanse, for example, and she really got into the characters. And it's the kind of thing where anytime you lose one of these characters that you've been following for a while and you're really interested in, it's just devastating. I'll say here, this was definitely not one of those books. I liked the characters, really I did. They were fascinating. I wanted to get to know them better, but I guess I just never really got the chance to feel deeply connected with any of the characters. And I don't actually know if I would be upset if any of the characters that I liked died, just because you haven't really established them enough to where I feel like they're a friend, or like I have been on this journey with them for so long that the novel kind of jumps around, and he's very good at doing that. But again, if you're really one of those readers who's into really getting deep down with a character and feeling like you're inside of them, or like you know them like a best friend, you're not going to quite get that here. It is kind of like Alastair Reynolds in that way, where you get kind of a little bit more of a bird's eye view. I wish he would have gone interior more often. Another part of it, I think, too, is that, and you see this with a lot of space opera, it's that the characters are a bit, I would say, Gnostic for my taste, where characters are just like these really cerebral, floating consciousnesses, and you never quite feel like you're in a human body. And I know that part of that just comes with the territory of space opera. It's the future, right? Pretty much everyone works in the information economy in some way or another. So everyone's using their brain for a living, and mind is certainly valued over matter in some ways. People are a little bit bionic. They've augmented their bodies so that they function like machines. It's set in the future, but there's just an aspect of the character work here that felt somewhat inhuman. And again, you get the same thing in Alastair Reynolds. There's just not enough checking in with the body, right? Being in the body. There's not enough of a sense of people's like hylomorphic humanity, their mortality as living, breathing human beings, because people aren't just floating minds. They're not just brains in vats. And so I just feel like the flesh should matter a little bit more in sci-fi, and people should be motivated by issues related to mortality and issues related to the imperfections of worldly things in the flesh. And that brings me to what I think is the big idea in this book. So that's a new segment here, the big idea. It's nearly 400 years in the future, and people in the Commonwealth Saga are basically immortal. It's not clear that anyone in this story really has to die unless they want to. Unless they're really poor or they're members of the Guardians of Selfhood, nobody really has to die, nor do they even really have to age. So once people age into their 40s or their 50s, they can get rejuvenated, which is basically this intensive treatment that rejuvenates everything and kind of turns back the clock in terms of aging and makes you look 20 or 30 or 40 years younger. And by the way, Hamilton does do a really good job making all of this seem plausible. In fact, if you do it too many times, people can pretty much always tell that you're not a first lifer and that you've been rejuvenated, just given sort of the bulk of your body and stuff like that. Still, if you want to, you can pretty much always keep rejuvenating yourself and look, for the most part, constantly young and attractive. There's even a procedure called relife, which means that if you're killed in some tragic accident or you're murdered or something happens to you, you have these stored inserts and memory cells, and you can come back in a body that is grown for you. And so this is one of the more ingenious aspects of the book, because people can essentially manipulate age to serve their purposes. For example, if you're a lawyer in a big trial, you can keep yourself older and grayer and look more middle-aged, so that the jury will trust you and you'll seem more distinguished and trustworthy. A husband and wife will rejuvenate themselves at the same time so that neither one of them has to sleep with a gross older partner. And so that whole aspect of the story is done so well, and it's definitely a fascinating kind of thought experiment in general. And there's more to it as well, like people can remove memories and keep them in a secure store, so for when they want to have nostalgic moments, you can pull them up on a screen, you can carry them around with you in these high density inserts so that you can load them into arrays and revisit your memories when you need them, but you don't have to have them always around so that they're kind of distracting you. People can use psychoneural profiling and processing functions to kind of like change their personalities and give themselves qualities. They can turn themselves into obsessive workaholics if they want to get rich and perform well at work. They can do cellular reprofiling so that they look different. So if you're a criminal, you can just have your face changed. So there are really no limits in this world. And there are definitely drawbacks to that story-wise, because limits sometimes can make a story more meaningful. But I also think that Hamilton does a really good job of making it feel realistic and kind of pulling it off, and unspooling, I would say, the consequences of a world in which you never have to worry really about your own mortality, and that age is something that is actually negotiable, right? And so it's interesting because in this world, because death isn't ever really final, murder isn't seen as the same horrifying crime that it once was. In fact, I believe the minimum sentencing for actually murdering someone is something like twice the period of life loss that you've taken away. And there are even things that you wouldn't think of, like sports. In this world, individual sports aren't as popular because they're essentially meaningless. As one character puts it at one point, it's essentially lab against lab, right? When it comes to like runners, right? You can just make a better calf muscle, right? And so you have these Frankenstein's monsters competing against each other, and as a consequence, it's kind of like the steroid debate. Sports become meaningless because there are no limits, and it just becomes kind of a contest of laboratories and technologies and science. So team sports are still popular, but individual sports aren't popular. But there's also, I love the fact, and I think that Hamilton really hits the nail on the head here. One of the most interesting kind of meditations is, you would think that an old person, and we're very used to the idea that an old person who's been alive for a really long time, in this case, hundreds of years, you would think that no matter how many times they rejuvenated themselves, or no matter how many times they've been relifed, you would think that they'd somehow age in terms of how they behave, that they'd get wiser or more seasoned in terms of the way that they see the world. And in some ways they do. If you've been around for hundreds of years, there is a kind of wisdom that you have and a knowledge that you have. But there are other ways in which, the longer that you live, if you're not actually aging, you still have the naivete of like a young person, right? For example, old people, when they've rejuvenated themselves and their body looks really good again, they actually do start acting like young people again. It turns out that when you still look young, even if you're old, you still act young. Because think about it, if you're a guy who's just been rejuvenated, women will start looking at you again, right? And you're not used to that. And so then you'll dress younger, right? And you'll end up going to these hip parties and you'll say things that younger people say, and you'll try to learn the lingo. And you're just invited to parties and events and soirees that you'd never be invited to if you were an old man. And so you kind of just adjust to whatever age people think that you are. You kind of adjust to the social consensus. And so you have these really old people that don't really act like old people. And there are other things like marriages in this story, for example, are seen as more temporary and transactional. You go into them kind of knowing that eventually you're going to get divorced because life is so incredibly long, and that sort of thing. So all of that is really fascinating, and I think it contributes to one of the big themes in the book. All right, I'm going to stop there because we are out of time. Subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Goodreads. Feel free to tip your starving booktubers on Patreon. I will see you guys next time. In the meantime, happy reading.